buckle up, everyone.
Yeah.
Because today's deep dive is going to be intense. We're talking about a story that's both powerful and, emotionally charged. It's Jerusalem. Passover time, tensions are running super high. And we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 15, the day of Jesus' crucifixion.
You know what's really fascinating about Mark's account? It's the way he just kind of throws these contrasting elements at us. You see like the darkest parts of human nature, betrayal and injustice and just suffering playing out against this backdrop of like unwavering faith. And ultimately, the ultimate sacrifice. And it makes you think, you really have to think about like the complexities of humanity. And, alongside the divine.
Definitely sets the stage for a powerful narrative. So let's just jump right in. Mark doesn't waste any time getting to the drama. Starts with the chief priests. They're acting swiftly and decisively against Jesus. They arrest him and hand him over to Pilate, the Roman governor.
And it's not just a simple handover either. Mark's very specific in chapter 15, verse 10. He states that Pilate knew that the chief priests were driven by envy. Think about that for a second. Jealousy. Their actions were fueled by jealousy of Jesus' popularity. And his influence.
Yeah, that really adds another layer to the whole betrayal, doesn't it? It's not just like a simple difference of opinion or some kind of interpretation. It was very calculated.
Yeah.
And it was rooted in this need to maintain power.
Absolutely. It really shows you like how far people will go when they feel threatened. They'll even resort to injustice to protect their own, interests.
So now we have Jesus brought before Pilate. And as the Roman governor, he's the one with all the power. He's the one who decides Jesus' fate. What happens next?
This is where things get really interesting. Pilate questions Jesus, and according to Mark chapter 15, verse 9, he doesn't find anything wrong with him. In fact, he even seems to want to release him. There's this back and forth between Pilate and the crowd, almost like he's arguing for Jesus' release.
That's so interesting. You'd think that, especially during a time like Passover, which is already so volatile, that a Roman governor would just appease the crowd. What do you think is going on with Pilate?
Well, it's complicated. Pilate has to walk a very fine line here, He's got to maintain the Roman authority, but he also has to appease the Jewish leaders, and they have a lot of influence over the people. So his desire to release Jesus, even though he ultimately doesn't, I think it shows that he sees that Jesus is innocent, and maybe he's even a little uneasy about condemning him.
So it sounds like Pilate's stuck between a rock and a hard place, knowing what's right, and caving into the political pressure.
Yeah, exactly. And it just highlights something that we see over and over in history, that struggle between what your conscience is telling you and what you think is the most practical thing to do, doing what's morally right versus what's politically expedient.
So how does this tension actually play out? If Pilate seems like he wants to release Jesus, how does it escalate to a crucifixion?
The crowd is a big factor. Mark describes how they're demanding that Pilate release Barabbas. He was a prisoner. And he was involved in a murder during an insurrection.
Wow. It's kind of hard to believe that the crowd would choose a convicted murderer over someone that even Pilate thought was innocent. How much power did they have over a Roman governor?
It really shows you the power of a mob. And Mark kind of hints that the chief priests were manipulating the crowd, stirring them up, making them angry, and really pushing them to demand Jesus' crucifixion. When you're in an atmosphere like that, it's so easy for reason and justice to get lost. It all just gets overshadowed by fear and manipulation.
So even though Pilate hesitated, it was the crowd that ultimately sealed Jesus' fate. And then, of course, comes a crucifixion, a form of execution that was known for being so brutal.
Absolutely. And Mark doesn't shy away from the details either. He describes the scourging, the crown of thorns, the soldiers mocking Jesus. And it wasn't just physical torture. There was a psychological element, too. Imagine being subjected to that kind of cruelty and then mocked as a king on top of it.
It's a really grim picture. And there's a small detail in Mark chapter 15, verse 21, that I think is especially powerful. It mentions Simon of Cyrene and how he was forced to carry the cross for Jesus. What do you think about that?
It's a reminder of just how heavy that cross was. It wasn't just a symbolic thing. It was a brutal, back-breaking reality. Having Simon carry it really emphasizes how grueling Jesus' journey to Calvary was.
And of course, this all leads to Jesus being crucified alongside two thieves.
Yeah.
Which Mark points out was fulfilling Scripture.
Yeah, that's important because for those early Christians, the fulfillment of prophecy was central to their understanding of Jesus, like his life and his death. And being numbered with transgressors, like the Old Testament predicted, really emphasizes how unjust the whole situation was.
It's a really powerful image. The innocent suffering with the guilty. It's a theme that we see all throughout history.
And it reminds us that injustice doesn't play favorites. It can touch anyone, the innocent just as much as the guilty.
And Mark doesn't let us forget how heavy this moment is. He describes this overwhelming darkness that descends upon the land during the crucifixion. It's mentioned in chapter 15, verse 33.
Hmm.
And it adds this feeling of mystery and dread.
Yeah, that darkness has been interpreted in a lot of ways. Some people see it as like a symbol of sin and evil taking over the world. Others think of it as a sign of God's judgment, or even some kind of cosmic event. But no matter how you interpret it, it emphasizes how serious this moment was.
And then there's Jesus' cry from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's from Mark 15.34. It's such a raw human cry, even in the middle of all this divinity.
It's one of the most debated passages in the Bible. Some scholars see it as a moment of real doubt, like a human expressing feeling abandoned by God. Others see it as a fulfillment of prophecy, specifically Psalm 22, which talks about the Messiah's suffering.
Right. Psalm 22 does describe suffering and abandonment, and even foreshadows a lot of details about the crucifixion.
And then there are some who think that cry represents the separation
Mm.
between Jesus' human nature and his divinity in that moment of sacrifice.
It's interesting to think about how one verse has led to so many interpretations throughout history. It really shows how complex faith is and how people experience and understand suffering in different ways.
Absolutely. But even in all this darkness and despair, there's this glimmer of something amazing. The Roman centurion who sees the crucifixion.
Oh, yeah. In Mark 15.39, he says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." What a moment. What do you think about the fact that it's a Roman soldier
Yeah.
and not a Jewish religious leader who recognizes Jesus?
It's definitely ironic. Mark doesn't tell us exactly what leads the centurion to this realization, but it's probably a combination of things. Maybe it was Jesus's composure, his unwavering faith even when he's dying a horrible death.
Maybe he saw something supernatural happen during the crucifixion, something that convinced him of who Jesus really was.
That's possible. Or maybe it was just some gut feeling, a moment of divine revelation that he couldn't even understand.
I think it's really interesting that Mark chooses to highlight the perspective of a Roman, someone outside of the Jewish faith, and kind of suggests that Jesus' impact wasn't meant for just one group of people.
Yeah, I think you're right. The centurion's words foreshadow how Christianity will spread beyond its Jewish roots, and how it will reach people from all walks of life, even those in power within the Roman Empire.
Definitely adds this universal element to the story. And even in this moment of death, there are people who remain completely loyal to Jesus. Mark 15.4041 talks about the women who are watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene. Their presence says a lot about the power of love and devotion.
It does. They represent that unwavering faith that holds strong even when facing unimaginable loss. And then you have Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. He's brave enough to ask Pilate for Jesus' body, and he gives him a proper burial. This is in Mark 15.4247.
That took guts, especially given the political climate and the fact that he could face serious consequences.
It's like this powerful act of defiance against all the fear and rejection surrounding Jesus. It shows how strong his convictions were and how quiet heroism can come from unexpected places.
So we're left with this image of Jesus in the tomb. It feels like an ending, a moment of defeat. But, as we know, this isn't the end of the story. Mark 15 is just one chapter, in a much bigger narrative. And it all depends on what happens next.
Exactly. This day of darkness, as important as it is, sets the stage for a day of triumph, the resurrection. And that's where we leave it up to you, our listener, to explore what happens next.
We've looked at the key players, the historical context, and the weight of these events. Now it's your turn to read the rest of Mark's gospel and find out what happens because of the resurrection.
What does it mean for Jesus' followers? How does it affect the future of Christianity?
These questions have been around for centuries, and we want you to think about them, to see how this ancient story, with all the complexities and contradictions, speaks to you today.
What stands out to you? What challenges what you thought you knew?
These are the kinds of questions that make deep dives like this so rewarding. We've given you the framework. Now it's up to you to discover the rest of the story.
Thanks for joining us. We'll leave you with this. The story doesn't end with a tomb. It begins with the resurrection.
Yeah, it's a powerful image, isn't it? The innocent suffering alongside the guilty. It's something we see over and over again throughout history.
It really is. And Mark doesn't shy away from the weight of the scene at all. He talks about this, overwhelming darkness that comes over the land. While Jesus is being crucified, it's mentioned in chapter 15, verse 33. And it just adds to the mystery and dread of what's happening.
Yeah, and in that darkness, it's been interpreted in so many ways. Some people see it as this symbolic representation of sin and evil, like it's descending on the world. Others see it as a sign of God's judgment. or even some kind of cosmic event. But regardless of how you interpret it, it really underscores the gravity of what's taking place. Absolutely. And then there's Jesus' cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's in Mark 15.34. Such a raw and human cry, even in the midst of the divine.
It's one of the most debated passages in the Bible, for sure. Some scholars see it as a moment of real doubt, a human expression of feeling abandoned by God, while others interpret it as a fulfillment of prophecy, specifically Psalm 22. It speaks of the Messiah's suffering.
Right. Psalm 22 really does paint a picture of suffering and abandonment, and it foreshadows so many aspects of the crucifixion.
Exactly. And still others believe that this cry represents the separation of Jesus' human nature and his divinity in that ultimate moment of sacrifice.
It's incredible how one verse can spark so many different interpretations throughout history. It really speaks to the complexity of faith
Yeah,
and the different ways we experience and understand suffering.
no doubt. And amidst all of this darkness and despair, there's this incredible moment with the Roman centurion who witnesses the crucifixion.
Well, yeah. In Mark 15.39, he says, "Truly this man was the Son of God." It's a powerful statement. What stands out to you about the fact that it's a Roman soldier and not a Jewish religious leader who makes this declaration?
The irony is pretty striking. Mark doesn't tell us exactly what leads him to that realization, but it's probably a lot of things coming together. Maybe it was Jesus' composure, that unwavering faith even while facing such a horrific death.
Or maybe the centurion saw something supernatural during the crucifixion, something that convinced him of Jesus' true nature.
Could be. Or maybe it was just this deep intuition, a moment of divine revelation that transcended his understanding.
It's fascinating that Mark chooses to highlight the perspective of a Roman, someone outside of the Jewish faith. It suggests that Jesus' impact wasn't meant to be limited to just one group or culture.
I think you're spot on. The centurion's declaration kind of foreshadows the spread of Christianity beyond its Jewish roots. It hints at its potential to resonate with people from all walks of life, even those in positions of power within the Roman Empire.
It definitely adds another layer of universality to the story. And even in this moment of death, there are those who remain steadfast in their loyalty to Jesus. Mark 15.4041 mentions the women who watched from a distance, including Mary Magdalene. Their presence speaks volumes about the enduring power of love and devotion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They embody that unwavering faith that stands firm even in the face of such immense loss. And then there's Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. He bravely steps forward to ask Pilate for Jesus' body, and he provides a proper burial. It's all detailed in Mark 15.4247.
It's an incredibly courageous act, especially considering the political climate at the time and the risks involved.
It's a powerful act of defiance against the fear and rejection surrounding Jesus. Joseph's actions highlight the strength of conviction and the quiet heroism that can emerge in the most unexpected places.
So we're left with this image of Jesus laid in a tomb. It almost feels like an ending, like a moment of defeat. But as we know, this isn't the end of the story. Mark 15 is just one chapter in a much larger narrative, and it all hinges on what happens next.
Precisely. This day of darkness, as profound and impactful as it is, sets the stage for a day of triumph, the resurrection. And that's where we'll leave it to you, our listener, to explore what comes next.
So we've been on quite the journey through Mark chapter 15. We've seen betrayal, injustice, incredible suffering. And it all ends with Jesus laid in a tomb.
It's definitely taken us through some dark parts of human nature, but even in those dark moments, we've also seen hope, unwavering faith, and just extraordinary courage.
Yeah, it makes you think about how even when things seem really dark, the human spirit, that faith and love, it can keep going.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really important point. Mark chapter 15 shows us the crucifixion, but it's just one part of a much bigger story.
Oh yeah, for sure. We can't forget about the resurrection. It's at the very heart of the Christian faith.
Exactly. Mark chapter 15, with all its darkness and despair, it's really just the setup for the triumph of the resurrection. It's the foundation of the whole Christian story.
And that's where we want you to keep exploring. We've spent time in the historical context, talking about the people involved, and the emotional impact of the crucifixion. Now it's your turn to see what happens next.
Crack open your copy of Mark's Gospel and keep reading. Dive into the events that happen after the crucifixion. See how Jesus' disciples react, how the resurrection story spreads, and what it means for that early Christian community.
What does the resurrection mean for those who believe? How does it change how they see Jesus' mission and his message? How does it change their lives?
As you read, we want you to think about the bigger picture. How does this story, with its themes of sacrifice, hope, and redemption, speak to you today?
Does it challenge how you think about things? Does it give you comfort or inspiration? Does it make you ask new questions about faith, suffering, and the meaning of life?
These are questions worth thinking about, and we hope this deep dive has helped you approach them with more understanding and curiosity.
Remember, the story doesn't end with a tomb. It begins with a resurrection. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Mark chapter 15.